Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Hudson. I'm the Director of the Centre for Palliative Care, and welcome to our Centre's Hot Topic webinar, where today we're going to be discussing CarerHelp, which is a national resource to help support family carers who are looking after somebody at the end of their lives. And this topic is particularly poignant at the moment as our society deals with some of the issues related to end-of-life care and death in the context of COVID. So I really hope you'll find the presentations this afternoon valuable. We've got 3 speakers, and we're going to allow some time at the end for questions and comments. So I really would appreciate, as you listen to the presenters, as you think of questions, to use the live chat feature that's available to you and note down your questions, and then at the end of the presentations, I'll be able to have that opportunity to feed those questions into our presenters. Or indeed if you've got comments. So questions or comments will be greatly appreciated. We'll also be getting a copy of this webinar, which will be made available on our Centre for Palliative Care website, hopefully within a week or so. So if you've got colleagues who are unable to join us today, then please do let them know that this will be available for their use at a later date when it's more convenient. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, and that's Dr. Tina Thomas. Tina is a Senior Research Fellow with the Centre for Palliative Care. She's been working with us for, I think it's probably about a decade or so, and has been integral to a program of inquiry, empirical inquiry, related to how we can better support family carers in the context of palliative care. So Tina's got a doctorate in psychology, and she's been involved in numerous studies and has really been, I suppose, the backbone of the CarerHelp project that you're going to hear about today. So I'd like to welcome Tina. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here today to talk about this project. It's something we've been working on for 3 years now at the Centre for Palliative Care, and we're delighted that it's available for people now to use and for health professionals to use with their families. We'd love to see you having a look at this after the webinar today, hopefully looking at aspects of the website that you think you could use with your families, and then referring them to the website for information. So today I'm going to take you through how the website was developed. I'll go through that fairly quickly, and then I'll get on to different aspects of the website that might be useful for you when you're working with your families. So here's sort of one of the home pages of the website, and as you can see, right on the home page it says the Carer's Guide to End of Life. So we're drawing people's attention straight away to the fact that this is about end of life. We really want to enable carers to feel more prepared when they're caring for a family member or a friend with advanced disease, and for them to feel supported and have the information they need to do the job well. As you can see down the bottom there, we had a number of partners involved with this project. So thanks to Jen Tierman and the Care Search team at Flinders, Deb Parker out at University of Technology Sydney, and Carers Australia. And of course, this project was funded through a National Palliative Care grant from the Australian Department of Health. So acknowledgement and thanks to them for supporting us with this. So first of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the challenges are related to carer support. So I'll go through this just quickly, and I think you're probably all very well aware of what the issues are. So in palliative care, we know that we should be supporting the family. The World Health Organization states that the family need to be supported as well as the patient. We also know from the literature that families and carers report lots of unmet needs, particularly informational needs, but also other needs as well. And we know that the burden on families is very high when they're caring for someone at the end of life, and that approximately one in two report moderate to severe levels of psychological distress. So this is a group of people who, life's pretty challenging for them for a period of time. that while there's lots of great services, palliative care services across Australia, we know that access to those services can be difficult, and it's not the same depending on where you live. And also even your treating team sometimes may unintentionally block you from getting palliative care services or delay those services, which means perhaps they're not as useful to you as a carer. We also know that health professionals are not necessarily trained to work with families. Some are, and that's great, but many aren't, or many get a very brief training in how to support families. So that's something we can probably work on and do better. But we also know that, there's not a lot of research funding in this area. Generally, services may not have sufficient resources to support families. And working with families is hard, it's complex, and it takes time, something that not all health professionals have. So thinking about, I guess those are the reasons why we thought some kind of website or online resource would be useful to carers, so that if they weren't linked in with palliative care, or even if they weren't able to get all of their needs met through their services, they could still go somewhere to find information and support. So you can see here, this is our sort of part of our plan for how we developed CarerHelp. And I won't go into too much detail here, but just to keep in mind, we did want this to be a really evidence-based resource. We wanted to make sure that we engaged and consulted with the right organisations and the right people. So we did a literature review. We looked at what the key information needs were. We found that generally those needs were the same regardless of disease type. So regardless of whether you're caring for someone with cancer or MND, a lot of those end-of-life information needs are similar, and experiences can be similar. We also conducted a scoping study of what was already out there, because we didn't want to be duplicating good resources, but we wanted to be linking to those good resources. And we also didn't, I guess we wanted to make sure that we linked to resources that we thought were evidence-based and came from organisations that were trustworthy. So there was a scoping study, and then of course there was our national reference group, where we had stakeholders from across Australia, key organisations that we knew would be able to help us make CarerHelp useful and relevant. Of course, we engaged with some consumers, so we did focus groups, we did interviews, we found out, well, what do carers really want from this website? What are the key topics that they need covered? And even terminology, what terminology works for different consumers. And we're lucky today because we have someone with us who will be able to talk to that. Then, of course, with the help of CareSearch and University of Technology of Sydney and Carers Australia, we built the resource, we tested it, we did some review surveys, and we launched it late last year, which was lovely, at Parliament House in Canberra. And there you can see our national reference group. So you can see there's a lot of organisations across Australia covered. And we were very lucky. We had people who were very engaged and gave us a lot of assistance and support. Okay, so now the website. So here's another homepage, and you'll find the homepage is a rolling homepage. We wanted to try and capture some diversity in our homepage, so that would encourage people to come and look at the website. And you can see from the CarerHelp website that both across the top toolbar and also in the grey squares along the bottom, it's mirrored in terms of the way you can go into the website. And there's really three ways you can go in. There's the carer pathways, the carer voices, or the carer library. And any of these three ways will take you in to find useful information. And I guess different people have different ways of finding information. So we're hoping to cater for different people. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pathways first. And I think as health professionals, this is probably a really useful diagram for you to speak to your families about. So the way we've conceptualised all the information that we've gathered and all the topics we wanted to present to families is in terms of pathways. And you can see there from pathway 1 to pathway 5 kind of captures the journey from the point where you're caring for someone with a serious illness, where you may be very engaged in that and it may be consuming, but you haven't actually started to think about end of life yet. Now, that's not really what CarerHelp's about. So we've included a pathway, but that pathway is really to refer people off to other sites, but also to highlight them that if you are ever having to deal with end-of-life issues, please come back. So then pathway 2 really is where CarerHelp kicks in, and that's looking at caring when death is a possibility. And in that pathway, we're talking about different terminology. What is end of life? What is palliative care? What is prognosis? How do I know how long the person has? Lots of questions that people have when they're just starting to recognise that death is a possibility. And often they've heard through a health professional. Sometimes they've just come to that realisation themselves by looking at disease content and understanding what's going on for their loved one. Then you've got pathway 3, which is really, there's a lot of information in pathway 3. It's about preparing to care for someone who's dying. So that's both practically, getting things in order so that later down the track it won't be as stressful emotionally, and also in terms of starting to think about recognising the signs of dying, what are the sort of common symptoms, and a whole range of other things. We've then got pathway 4, which is actually when the person is dying, and I'll talk about that a little bit more after. And lastly, our sort of grief and bereavement pathway on after caring. So just looking at pathway 3 as an example to see how it's laid out. And just to say, if you're talking with your families, you may want to help them identify which pathway they're on. That can be really useful, and direct them to where they need to go on the website. And you'll find for each of the pathways, we've tried to really tailor it to find with resources that we think will help the person at this particular time, rather than bombarding them with all the possible information. It's saying, okay, you're here, and maybe these sorts of things would be helpful to you at this time. So when you come to a pathway, you'll see there's a blurb just to help the person understand, oh yeah, this is right for me, this is where I'm at. Then there might be a module or a video that we really want people to watch because that has the really key information. And then down the bottom, there'll be some extra resources that we think are really relevant at this time. So you can see here we've got a module on general caring at this time, but we've also got another specific module on managing symptoms and recognising dying, which is very specific. So when you go down and you have a little bit more, you'll see there's some more resources. Now, some of our resources are fact sheets, and some of our resources are actually templates that they can use, or you can give them to fill in. So it might be a timetable, it might be a self-care plan, it might be a question prompt list, things that you can use when you work with them, and things that they can use to just help themselves feel more organised and keep track of all those names and numbers and different times and things that can be really overwhelming when you're a carer. You'll also see there's one here called Is Caring at Home an Option? Now that's a little interactive resource that actually asks the carer a number of questions to help them think about whether caring at home is actually an option now, but also what might be the factors that means caring at home might be really difficult later. And it just helps to have that conversation. So that's something you might like to try using with your families, or just to let them know is there. Now, similarly, there's something called the Carer Check. And if we have a look at that, you'll see there's 8 questions there. This is based on the Preparedness for Caregiving scale. And it's just a really nice, simple scale that you can do with your families or have them do on their own, but it means that you can find out what their information needs are. So how well prepared are you for caring with your relatives' physical needs? Now, if they're not well prepared for that, then you know that you can spend a bit more time working on that. So it just helps highlight what are their needs at this time. Now, if you're not doing this with the family and they're doing it on their own, of course, when they finish the carer check, they actually get directed to some key resources based on their responses. So it's quite, it helps tailor the information again. Okay, and here's pathway 4. So just to look at a different pathway to get a feel for it. When the person is dying, I guess what we were trying to do here was really think about the last 72 hours of life and maybe the 12 hours immediately following death. And knowing that the person is probably very busy, very time poor, very stressed. We really just wanted to provide a very simple way for them to get the information they needed. So you can see here we've got 2 videos, one of Mark Bowie, a palliative care consultant, talking about what happens when the person dies in very simple English to help them understand what's normal, what might be concerning, when might they need to seek help, but also how to comfort people during those last 72 hours. What can they actually do to help make that experience more comfortable? Then we've got Regina, a palliative care nurse practitioner, talking about body care and what to do after the death. And she does a lovely job just talking about there's no rush. You can sit with the person as long as you want if they're at home or in the hospital, and what happens next? Who do you call? How do you make sure that, keep the room cool, things like that. So very practical advice. All right. Now, we have a lot of fact sheets that we've developed and templates, and it's really useful, I guess, as a health professional to consider looking at these in advance and printing them off. So they're all PDFs. You can print them off. You could take them with you on your home visits or when people come in, and then you've got something to give people if they're really finding they don't know enough about recognising dying, for example. So I would encourage you to have a look at those. They're all only sort of 1 or 2 pages long. We've tried to keep them very simple so as not to overwhelm people. So that's the pathways. The good thing about the pathways too is people can choose themselves to go, I want to look ahead and see what's coming, or no, I'm not ready to do that. I'll just stick with where I am. So that can be a nice thing to talk to your families about as well. Now, the carer voice section. I know some people are not interested in information and they'd really prefer to just hear about other people's experience, and that's a really valid way to learn and feel prepared for what you're embarking on. So the carer voice section has 4 carers, and we basically follow them through their journey from, becoming a carer, what impact did it have on your life, how did you look after yourself, and through to dying. So there's lots of snippets there and videos, and people can choose what they watch, what they're interested in. So that's another resource. And lastly, the carer library, which is very much like a traditional library on any website. You can find a topic that you need information on and you can go in there, and there'll be lots of links out to other websites. There'll be resources. They're all from organisations that we feel are trustworthy and evidence-based. And also you can see there's a section up front on CarerHelp sheets. So that's all the CarerHelp fact sheets in one place, and a section on CarerHelp videos, which is all the videos in one place. And you can see a nice list there, which is always growing. We always get requests for new fact sheets. You're welcome to send some requests in if you see anything missing. And here's our videos. So in addition to Mark and Regina doing some videos for us, we also have Chris Hall, who is a psychologist and a grief expert, doing some lovely videos on grief and tips for managing grief. Now, of course, living through COVID-19, we needed some resources that were specific to caring within this context. And that's things like increased reliance on telehealth, how can I support people with social distancing. So there's lots of information there. There's a number of fact sheets that have been developed and are available on the website. That's our launch photo. And just finishing up, again, I encourage you to have a look and tell your colleagues about it and refer families to CarerHelp to use. We'd love your feedback. And I'll wait for some questions later and hand back to Peter now. Thank you. Hi, I'm back, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who's Mr. Kang Chen, and he is a lovely gentleman who cared for his partner Benjamin. and he actually was very involved in developing CarerHelp, and he's one of the people who's in our Carer Voice section, and we're really lucky to have him today. He's been very supportive of the project, and I can't tell you any more about him, but I will ask him to talk about himself a little bit as he starts telling you about his experience as a carer.
Thank you, Tina. Yes, hi, my name is Kung. Before I continue on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri, Woi, Wurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation that I'm on, and I'm sure that we're all on different traditional owners across Australia, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal people watching this webinar. Thank you, Tina. I'd also like to thank the Centre for Palliative Care and St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, for inviting me to contribute to the CarerHelp website. It's an amazing website, and I'm honoured that you've invited me to speak at today's webinar as well. So thank you very much for that. So my name is Kung, and I was the carer to my late husband, Dr. Benjamin Lesky, as Tina said. So I'll just sort of talk a bit about the journey and about Ben's diagnosis. So Ben was diagnosed with a brain tumour in 2012 and died 6 years later in March 2018 at the age of 37. And being a carer to Ben was an absolute privilege. It's one of the most rewarding roles that I have undertaken in my life. And caring for someone, I believe, is one of the purest forms of love. And that can be, whether you are a partner, a parent, a child, a family member, or even a friend. And in caring for Ben, we were able to spend more quality time together and do things together, which was so important as a carer and as a family as well. And over the 6 years, we created beautiful memories by building a home together, spending time with our families and friends, traveling the world. And one of the biggest achievements that Ben was able to achieve basically was celebrating his PhD graduation. So it's a monumental feat to be able to do a PhD while you're living with a brain tumor, but he was able to do that and to finally graduate from it. And one of my proudest moments was getting married. So we were able to get married under the change to the marriage legislation, and we were very fortunate to do that. And the hospice where we were staying, they were so graceful in allowing us to get married in the chapel. So that was a beautiful, beautiful ceremony, and something that I will cherish forever. So in the midst of, the uncertainty of living with a cancer diagnosis, I guess, being a carer gave me a sense of purpose that was, both fulfilling and also grounding, because living with uncertainty just brought so many challenges. And I guess, by virtue of being his husband and being his carer, I knew Ben's values, I knew his aspirations, I knew, his sense of self, which meant that I, as a carer, was able to support him to exercise his agency, and also to help him live the life that he valued. And that in turn enabled me to live the life that I valued as a carer. caring for Ben in the last 6 months of his life was a heartbreaking time, but it was an experience that was full of love, beauty, and sacredness, and we couldn't have done that without the support of our family, friends, and medical professionals who were so intuitive, who were so supportive, who were so aware of what our needs were along the way. So in those last few months, I took time off from my full-time job to become his full-time carer. As you know, as a carer, I took him to medical appointments. I cooked and assisted him with everyday living, and so those everyday tasks were so ordinary, and yet they were so extraordinary. And now that he's not here with me physically, the memories that sustain me the most are the time during which I cared for him. So those things are so important that we need to acknowledge and support people who are caring to be able to do that on a day-to-day basis. Now, having said all that, being a carer was also one of the most difficult and challenging roles that I've ever had to undertake. There were many times where I was overwhelmed by the task of being the carer. It challenged me on so many levels, psychologically, emotionally, financially, socially, and there were times where I felt lost and alone. And I guess at this time during the pandemic, especially in places like Melbourne, where we're living with restriction stage 4, it must be so difficult for a lot of people and a lot of carers to continue to do the work and to continue to care in the context of isolation. Caring for a loved one with a life-limiting illness does have wide, ranging impacts on the carer, on our, physical, mental health, and overall quality of life as well. And I think this is where the CarerHelp website would have helped me in navigating the many issues that I faced as a carer. And things like, what it means to be a carer, learning about the practical aspects of caring, and understanding how my relationships with not only Ben, but also with other people in my life would change as a result of my caring role. And that's something that people just have to acknowledge, that people have to, accept and be able to manage the change and get support to go through that change. Other things like, also recognizing the emotional impact of being a carer. And I think that was something that I didn't fully appreciate as a carer, and the importance of looking after myself, mentally, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And then, going on to other practical matters such as, knowing how to get financial and legal help. And I think, the CarerHelp website does provide some resources and information about that. And other things like, planning for the future and then ultimately planning for end of life stage. Those are things that are really useful. And for me personally, being able to read and hear about other carers' experiences would have helped this, reduce the sense of being alone. And I think Tina talked about that, where people might find that, reading something might be a little bit too overwhelming, and they just simply want to, watch or hear people talk about their experiences. So I guess I I believe that, providing carers with a website like CarerHelp, alongside other resources such as, carer support groups. I think carer support groups are so important and integral to maintaining the well-being of carers, will reduce the sense of isolation that many carers experience, particularly at this time as well. And I think CarerHelp will certainly be a useful resource, particularly for new carers, and for those carers who may be reluctant for whatever reason, or find it difficult to take that first step in seeking outside help. And I think the CarerHelp website will also be an additional resource that will empower carers and their loved ones in making the right choices that will improve their quality of life as well. And I think for me personally, going through the whole palliative care journey and experience, choice has always been an important thing for me and for Ben. And so being able to provide choice in the way that we want to be supported and cared for is so important. I think that's about it from me. So I'll hand over back to Peter. Hopefully we've resolved the technology issues. So back to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Kung. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. Apologies for that little hiccup earlier on. I also note that there were a couple of people who just had some volume issues, so hopefully that's been rectified now. So if not, please use that option you have to feed that back, and we'll address that if there's any further issues. Look, thanks for that, Kung. That's fantastic, and we've really struck gold. I can't remember, it must have been Tina, I assume, who found Kung initially, but he's just been such an asset to this resource that we've developed. He was involved in our launch at Parliament House. He's done a video for CarerHelp and just been such an advocate, and to have somebody speak so poignantly and sensitively about his personal experience on a number of occasions. It must be so difficult, and we do appreciate your time and effort, Kung, and your candour about your experience and your advocacy work around this. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of all of us. I'd now like to hand over to Associate Professor Mark Bowie. Many of you will know Mark. For those of you who don't, Mark is really one of the nation's leaders in palliative care. He's been really involved, I suppose, in the evolution of the movement of palliative care in Australia, and held numerous senior appointments. Currently the Director of Palliative Medicine at St Vincent's, Deputy Director of the Centre for Palliative Care. He's the Chair of Victoria's Safer Care Victoria Palliative Care Clinical Network. He sits on other committees and is deeply passionate about improving the quality of life of patients and families and trying to influence systematic change across the sector and more broadly. And for those people that know Mark, I think nearly all of them would say they'd like him to look after them if they ever needed a doctor. So just such a fantastic and genuine person, and he's going to talk about now the extension of CarerHelp. And over to you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. And it's great to be able to follow such an insightful and always moving account of Kang's time and Ben's and their life together, and the time where end of life was obviously front and centre in their lives as they moved towards Ben's death. I think we recognise clearly, and I think COVID in many ways has brought it into the spotlight, that the connection of a carer or carers to their loved one is so critical, and when that connection is broken or not able to be maintained, as we're finding in the current COVID space, that the amount of distress that it can cause and the ripple effects it can cause is quite significant. And I think we're experiencing it ourselves with the patients we're looking after at the moment, who are shifting and moving from community to hospitals, from aged care facilities and so forth, that disconnection between who would have been their traditional carers, be family, partners, loved ones, even relatives, neighbours, so forth, even the people who are professional carers. I think it's going to be not only the grief and loss for the carer, but for the ripple effect of the professionals and people around them ongoing. So I think it's important to understand that any resource that's been developed and evolved tends to, even though it's taken 3 years to develop, is broad in its brushstrokes, and it's going to speak to the more dominant culture, more dominant language, more dominant abilities of a carer to access resources that are on the internet and so forth. So there, in designing the beginning, there's such an assumption in this space, and so we were fortunate in working from the original CarerHelp project to look at the whole sense of diversity and so forth. And as we wanted to understand, we recognised that there was a number of carers that maybe our resources would speak to in part, but really wouldn't necessarily have the ability to bring the meaning that they wanted to get, that others have found from the resources and such forth that we needed to do. We also find that the patients that are being looked after aren't always a sort of generic group of people that can access these things. And often working at a place like St Vincent's, we meet some of the people with the most vulnerable connections to society, the most vulnerable abilities or disabilities, people with significant mental health issues, people with difficulties in maintaining a location where they can be cared for and so forth. So there are a lot of people, obviously, that we aren't able to reach. And again, this is how we sort of conceptualised our project going forward. We also recognise that language, and as we've known in the COVID environment, again, we see when language isn't connected in an appropriate way so that people can understand what's there, what they can do, and so forth. And those things can go awry very quickly in the wrong circumstances. So in some ways it's precedent but timely that I think we were granted a further 3-year project to be able to focus on what we're calling CarerHelp diversity. And in this particular environment, when I'm talking about translation, it really isn't translating in what we traditionally think in the language groups of translation and it's really looking at that whole notion of how can people access these resources and make them meaningful to not only the person who's looking at the resources, but also meaningful if they're going to be working with patients, working with family members, working as a carer. So there's a two-edged part to this equation. And that whole translation part is so important. If you can think of the effort and energy that's going into nowadays of having people with Auslan translators, the audio descriptors that are on TV programs now, you can see that there's a wealth of knowledge and understanding that to connect to the most people, the majority of people, we need to be thinking a little bit differently. And so we really need to think about not only what we would consider the traditional carers, but we need to think about the support workers, volunteers, community people that would be working with people who are maybe part of their council, part of their community, happen to be neighbours and so forth. We recognise that people, obviously, in the disability arena and the beginnings and the stepping into the space of the NDIS opens many doors now. So we need to be able to connect to those workers that can then provide the care, but also understand that they are carers in maybe a more professional or paid employment. So I think it's really important that we're reaching to these very sort of more people that want to be able to trust the information they're looking at, trust the ability to be cared for, but maybe haven't found the meaning that we were expecting them to find in the resources that we've developed. So again, it feels like big brushstrokes, but I think we're trying to narrow our focus to make sure that we can indeed make sure that we are able to reach audiences and to be part of that, and people do find meaning. And again, if people can't access the IT, then somebody else can do it for them, but then work with them in that space as well. As we well know, many people who've come from non-English speaking backgrounds rely very heavily on either siblings or sons and daughters, nieces and nephews to be the translators. And in some way, we want to create an ability that we can have a meaningful way of translating things in all sorts of different and maybe ways that we haven't even thought of as we're starting to go into the scoping process. So most of this is really related to doing very similar work to Tina has been part of the original project and will continue in this project space, but really we're just at the beginning of starting this process of setting up the national reference group, taking our steps into the scoping activities, and then mapping the way we can utilise different technologies, but also to understand of other ways of trying to develop and modify and how we might be able to translate resources in new and creative ways. And I think it'll be exciting to find out. We want to recognise there are many groups out there doing work in this space. We really want to make sure that those groups are focused on carers in this work. And so we want to make sure, again, we're not overlapping and creating resources that may already be there but just need to be linked to the work that we're doing. So really that's just to say we're embarking on the beginning of this, and we're sort of we'll be sort of working through in the next few months to make sure that we're on track and then taking this forward. So it's an exciting time. It's nice to have a distraction from COVID for me as a healthcare professional at the moment. But I think really it's taught us a great deal as to the urgency in many ways of what the work ahead needs to not only have the resource like CarerHelp, but to build on that resource and its reach. So thank you. I will hand back to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you. Much appreciated. So now it's over to you, the audience. We've got quite a number of questions that have come in, but just a reminder to please use that question facility or make some comments, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. As you've seen, we're a fairly kind of docile group, so don't feel anyway threatened if you've got some questions or comments, and that can be, we welcome critical feedback as well. So if there's ways of improving CarerHelp, for those of you who looked at it before, please don't hesitate to comment now, or there is a platform through the site. Okay, I'll go to some of the questions. So a question from Rose, who's been complimentary about the site. Thank you very much. And she's just wondering whether any of the leaflets can be used as introductions or downloaded that they can actually hand out to carers. So maybe, Tina, if you're able to answer that, please.
I'm assuming you just mean like a generic brochure about the CarerHelp website, and there are some that exist. I'm not actually sure if they're on the website though, so I'll have to check that. But we do plan to send those brochures out to all, well, actually, I think they've already received them. All palliative care services in Australia should have received those brochures. How about flick us an email at carerhelp.com.au and we'll get back to you.
Right, thank you. And another question about some information on the website. So from Mary, who asked that if it's possible and where appropriate, can healthcare organisations use the fact sheets and provide them to carers as part of their information kits?
I'll answer that too. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're hoping that health professionals will do. So they're all free. They're all PDFs, so they're really easy to just download and print off. So please use them. Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you. And Gina asks, is the CarerHelp website and the content contained within it available in any other languages apart from English?
Yeah, no, it's not at the moment, and that's really what the focus of the next 3 years is, to try and make it much more inclusive to a whole range of people who might speak different languages or have slightly different needs. Yeah, as Mark was talking about. So we look forward to doing that.
And can I just add, I mean, there's a huge amount of work that people have done already around Australia, and so we want to make sure that we can complement that and connect it rather than just replicate for the sake of translating. We know the difficulties that translation can lead to if it's not done in an appropriate way. So we're hoping that we will be able to complement in that way.
Thank you, Mark and Tina. And a question from Mary, and she comments it looks like a great resource for clients and carers who have IT skills with interest and access. Is there anywhere the same information can be found by disadvantaged clients or carers and those who, for whatever reason, cannot access the online program?
Well, that's again, thank you, Mary. Look, again, just to reiterate, this is the next 3 years. This is the recognition that we need to be able to speak to the people that can't necessarily access this in a way that they can either read it or access it as part of sort of IT, smartphone, laptop type technology. So the spoken word and so forth. I think, again, as we've tried to do, there are different ways of trying to reach people, and we need to talk to the community groups that are already working in this space so that we can better tailor things to the spoken word, etc. and so forth.
Thank you. And a question from Jen, a recognition that the Carer Gateway, carergateway.gov.au already exists, and this is a website that has a range of online supports for carers and provides pathways and lots of information around the caring role, including support information around practical concerns. So just wondering, I suppose the subtext there, I imagine, from Jen is that have we utilised Carer Gateway? How do we avoid duplication with this resource? So maybe Tina, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And Carer Gateway is a fantastic resource. And we looked at Carer Gateway, in fact, when we were writing our application for the money for this project. And what we found on Carer Gateway regarding end of life was that there's definitely information, and it's good information. It's just not very detailed. It doesn't go into the nitty-gritty. And there's not really any other website that does go into the nitty-gritty. So we think our website is actually filling a gap. It's meeting a need. Some things will be repeated. You will find stuff on self-care, absolutely, on Carer Gateway, and there's lots of things that probably are repeated. But I guess the idea for us is that we're really delving into it. And getting really, there's an awful lot of information, and we talk in detail about dying, what happens as the body shuts down, what's normal, what's not normal. Carers wanted to know that when we talked to them in the focus groups. They wanted to know that detail. They were scared of what would happen if their partner died at home. They were worried about what would happen if it seemed like the person couldn't breathe, or what was that noise? What does that mean? So that's the sort of detail that we go into. So it is very different. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And a question from Tracy, who asks, is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in scope for the project at this stage?
Going forward, I think previously, certainly, but certainly that is an important consideration. Obviously, we need to make sure, and again, to reiterate, a number of great resources are already developed, and again, we just need to make sure that we can be synergistic with what's been developed and be able to connect in a way that's meaningful for people depending on location, abilities, sort of language and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. And just, I think there's at least 6 people who have come in and made comments just to say thank you to Kung for your willingness to share your experience and your story. So I just want to acknowledge those people that have conveyed that. And then a question from Mary, who asks whether or not the paediatric and AYA community will be or have been involved in CarerHelp.
That's a great question, Mary. We actually decided to make this just about caring for someone who was an adult, because we recognised that caring for a child can be a very different experience, and there's certainly a lot of additional concerns and information that we would need to cover. So that may be something in the future, but I know that there's already another national palliative care project that's funded around paediatrics. So I think there's already someone else doing something in that space. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we may have answered this, but if not, please complement one of the previous responses from Nora. Were people of other cultures and language groups consulted at the early stages at any stage?
I can answer that. Actually, we had FECA, which stands for the Federation of Ethnic Communities of Australia. We had them involved on our national reference group, and that was really useful. And while we didn't have the resources to be considering meeting the needs of each different called community at that time, that's something that we now hope that we can look into in more detail. We did have FECA involved to give us advice and guidance around that. So definitely they were involved. Yeah.
Thank you. And a specific question for Kung, if you wouldn't mind. It's from Mary, who asks, what is the most important information you wish you could have known about when you were caring for Ben?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Oh dear. Look, I think for me, the thing that I wish I had known while I was caring for Ben was how hard it was, how hard caring can be. And I wish I knew how important it was to, look after myself. And I guess, self-care is so important. And I think, a lot of people talk about it and it becomes a cliche, but I realised that during caring that it would have been helpful for me to know that from the outset to practice self-compassion and doing things that would actually fill my emotional bucket, and also that socialising with caring people with whom I feel safe is so important for my mental health. So for anybody who is caring, I think it is so important to take care of ourselves in order to take care of others.
Thanks. And the question from Jen, and Jen asks, were the Commonwealth Carer Respite and Centrelink centres part of developing this?
No, they haven't been. We did obviously link to some Centrelink and Centrelink resources and information, and Carers Australia was heavily involved. I didn't, Peter, hear the other organisation?
It was Carer Respite and Centrelink, so Carer Respite Services.
Yeah, we didn't have Carer Respite Services involved, and that, that might be something that's probably lacking actually on the website. So thank you for that. Is probably some link off to make sure that carers know where to find respite services. Thank you.
Great. Look, we've run out of time, and I just want to acknowledge the number of questions. So thank you very much. There's quite a number have come in, including some very favourable comments and also some suggestions. So thank you all for listening to the webinar, but also taking the time to make a comment or ask a question where pertinent. So thank you very much for being so engaged. As I said at the start, but just in case you hadn't joined us at the beginning, this will be available. We're recording it, so hopefully in a week or so, if you check our Centre for Palliative Care website, and then you can make it available to others who are unable to attend today's webinar. But just to thank all our speakers and just the time and effort that they've put in to their presentations today, and it's greatly appreciated. And thank you all for participating and taking the time to join this afternoon's webinar. I do want to close with a lovely comment from Jackie, who has remarked how influential Kung's presentation was, and she notes that she specifically liked his words that, and I quote, "Caring for someone, I believe, is the purest form of love." And she goes on to say some lovely things about about that comment and other reflections from Kung. So I think that's a lovely way to end today's webinar, and just to thank everybody again, and look after yourselves, and please come along to our next webinar. All the best. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.